So it occurred to me again that I don't want you to start thinking, you know, what is the purpose of this course? I haven't told you the purpose of this course. I have been traumatized by this statement. Household finance, as I told you, is a new field, relatively new field. What does it study? It studies the asset, saving behavior and the borrowing behavior of households. And who are households? Everybody is a household. Even if you are by yourself, you form an orderly household of one. Okay, so these problems are problems that everybody follows, right? And will follow, everybody faces and will face in their lives sooner or later. I'm talking to you about retirement and you're thinking, oh, yeah, I mean, too many years, but actually, you know, you have to know the system and you have to know and start saving early. But it's not just saving and borrowing, and I said, you know, we pay attention to the rich, but actually right now there is a lot of attention to the poor as well, and there are papers, more and more papers from development economics that get presented in household finance conferences, and there are very interesting things that have issues that have to do with entrepreneurship, and also with loans, lending, right, and micro lending to households in emerging developing countries. So the topics that we're going to do, although you know the initial focus was on the rich, but it was not only on the rich, but there was a lot of focus on the rich. But now there is a lot of focus on at the other end of the spectrum, and it's going to be very important for a country like Vietnam that is evolving, you know, financially. I think it's going to be extremely relevant to understand, you know, the forces and the features, you know, of holding of different types of financial products, and also the issues of financial literacy. You know, how do you get, it's not just the holdings, but then how do you get people to participate and take advantage of risky products without being destroyed by the risk? You know, you want to get the expected returns, you know, the higher actual returns without being destroyed by the risk. So financial literacy, financial advice, campaigns, operating also through peers, etc., are going to be extremely important issues, I think, also for Vietnam. And, you know, the other thing is this, not many people take a course like this, I mean, more and more, but it will be quite unique, I think, in Vietnam having this knowledge. In terms of who is interested in household finance research, you have, of course, the academics. I think, you know, right now I am together with Steve Zelders from Columbia University. We are running the Social Science Research Network, the SSRN journal on household finance, so the abstracts. Have you come across SSRN? Have you visited SSRN? It's a very good source for working papers, right?
Yeah, I get most of your recommended paper from there.
Precisely, from SSRN. So we are running it now. There were some other guys running it for many years, and we took it over. And we use, you know, I guess a couple of years ago, there used to be one email per second week with 5 papers on, right? New working papers on household finance. So one email for 2 weeks with 5 papers. And now we are sending out 4 emails per week with 8 papers. So 32, and we still can't get, you know, the stock of papers down that we have to circulate, right? So it's really exploding in terms of interest. I also want to say that you go to conferences and you see people, you know, participate doing asset pricing research. You go and you try to see if there are any women there. The women who are there are alone, right? So there is no queue in the bathrooms for women. The ladies' bathroom, no queue, right? Because it's 1, 2 per conference. You go to household finance conferences, endless queues, because we have, without trying, we have gender balance in terms of the researchers in this area. And it makes sense because household, you know, we are all members of household and we do get interested in these topics. Corporate finance is somewhere in between and banking is somewhere in between, where household finance is completely gender balanced. There are the academics, there are the central banks that are very interested because they have figured out that monetary policy effects depend on portfolio composition of people. You are lowering interest rates. Who has a mortgage, who has a pension account, you know, that creates distributional consideration, you know, distributional effects. And of course the transmission to households of any lowering or raising of interest rates, etc. So you get the academics, you get central banks, you get ministries of finance or economics, you get private banks, you get insurance companies, because there is research on insurance as well, not as much as we would have liked, but it's getting there, right, in household finance. You get, you can do research in the, Deutsche Bank Research does a lot of research on household finance, but you can also go there, and if there is not enough research, you tell them you're sitting on so much data that you're not using, so let's try to use it. So there are extremely good prospects, as I said, and a lot of money in this as well. If you're an academic, you can go to a high-paying finance department. If you are central banks and international organizations pay very well. I told you OECD is really funding the financial literacy programs, etc. And of course, private practitioners, if you tell them that they are ignoring their customer data and they can do so much with it, they will be very interested as well. So I'm teaching you how to get rich, okay? So none of this comment, I don't understand the point of this course, okay? The point of this course is you to get rich. Not really. But anyway, I had to try. Okay, so you remember, just to recall, our two-asset model, right? So you have, you see? You cannot see what I'm showing. Let me see. Yes. Okay, so we have the maximization of expected lifetime discounted utility. At each point in time, you get this cash on hand, XT, and you divide it between consumption, investment in the riskless asset, and investment in the risky asset. And you have the transition equation for cash on hand. So at the start of period T+1, you're going to get how much you had saved in stocks plus return, 1 plus R is this. Plus how much you had saved in the riskless asset times 1 plus the riskless rate, plus your labor income for next period. And of course you have the non-negativity constraint on consumption. You have the two first order conditions. You recall the reductio ad absurdum, so you expand them, you subtract one from the other, you come up with this result over here, and then the absurdum, you assume zero stock holding is the optimum, so you set ST equal to 0, and then you go through this and you consider two cases. One case is random labor income is non-random, and if that's the case, you have killed the randomness here, you have a 0 over here, so this U prime is non-random, so you can take it out of the, you can still call it expectation, but this expectation of the product is the product of the expectations. This is non-random. This is random, and we have the absurd result that the product of two positive numbers is 0, right? So it cannot be that with non-random labor income, stock holding is 0, and then if you have random labor income but uncorrelated with a stock return, right? You can still decompose this expression into the product of the two expectations because they are uncorrelated, the sources of randomness. So xt plus 1 is random because you have random labor income, but it's uncorrelated with r tilde t plus 1, the stock return. So you can write out this expanded product, or in more convenient form this thing, and you continue to have the same problem, that the product of two positive numbers must be 0. So you know that also with non-random labor income uncorrelated with stock returns, you cannot have 0 stock holding. Okay? So that is violated by the majority of the people, this implication. And I had told you, you have higher expected return, but 0, starting with 0 stock holding, you have 0 covariance between marginal utility of consumption and the stock return. So the puzzle is, as I had told you, risk aversion. Grandma says, some people are more risk averse than others and they don't want to hold stocks. This doesn't solve it, right? Because I didn't tell you anything about risk aversion, and I could still get, I told you, okay, people are risk averse, but I didn't tell you about the magnitude of risk aversion, and I can still get the absurdum. And earnings risk. So let's think about earnings risk. So here, I have considered one case of risky income, and that is the uncorrelated, risky but uncorrelated labor income with stock returns. Okay? So here, let me come and consider the two other risky income cases. One is negative correlation with stock returns, between labor income and stock returns. The other is positive correlation. Okay, let's consider the negative correlation. What does that mean? This means that when your labor income goes down, maybe because of the business cycle, unemployment, whatever, your stock returns go up. Stock returns go up. Okay? If you are in such a case, holding stocks insures you against bad income realizations, right? So you have an even bigger reason to want to hold stocks relative to uncorrelated income and stock returns. You have a hedging motive to hold stock returns, to hold stocks, right? Because if you're holding stocks, because they are moving in opposite direction with labor income, they hedge your labor income risk, right? So that model is going to produce even more stock holding than this model. So I don't have a problem arguing that the model fails to describe reality, right? The non-stock holding reality. But let's go to the other case, which is trickier, right? This is a case of positive correlation between your labor income and stock returns. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that when your labor income is high, the stock market is high. When your labor income is low and you would need stocks to be high, they are low, right? So you are moving your labor income and stock returns. The stock market is moving in the same direction as your labor income. It exacerbates your income risk. So what is going on in such a case, right? If you write down a model in such a case, you are very likely to want to short stocks, okay? Because when you short stocks, when you are borrowing by promising to pay stocks, right? And your labor income goes down, the stock return will go down, you will have to pay less for your loan, right? So that's going to help you. So a model with positive covariance between labor income and stock returns is likely going to give you optimal shorting of stocks, okay? And then some people got excited about this, and they said, okay, let's put a no short sales constraint. It is real, it is a feature of reality that households are mostly not allowed to short stocks, okay? So you want to short stocks, and I'm not letting you short stocks, and you are stuck at zero stocks, and maybe this is the explanation for the stock holding puzzle, right? But for this explanation to hold generally, right, what it means is that the non-stockholders, all the people, the majority of the people in the economy who are not holding stocks are frustrated short sellers, right? They would have liked to short stocks, and somebody told me you cannot short stocks, and they went to zero. That's not true. Your grandma who doesn't hold stocks, and whoever I know who doesn't hold stocks, they are not holding stocks for a million other reasons, but not because they wanted to short stocks and nobody let them short stocks. So, yes, mathematically it's possible to generate zero stock holding through a combination of positive covariance and a no short sales constraint. Mathematically it's possible, but economically it's not reasonable. It's not realistic that people who are not holding stocks are frustrated short sellers. Okay? So it doesn't work. In other words, earnings risk doesn't give us a solution to the problem. And then we had seen and we had discussed that this type of liquidity constraints, that your net wealth is not allowed to go to become negative, that thing doesn't work either, because it just produces one Lagrange multiplier, and when I subtract one first order condition from the other, it disappears. And that this thing over here does work, but it has this frustrated short seller implication. And we'll see it again. Okay. So let's go a little bit to solutions, right? And that we didn't do in Macro. So that is new now. The solutions to participation puzzle. So the most popular, widely used solution is something we had proposed early on, which was fixed cost of entry or participation. Actually, if you go back to the 95 paper, which is my most cited paper, so if you're going to read anything I have written, you go and read what I did in 95. Okay. But we had introduced fixed cost of entry. Okay. So what's the idea here? In the standard model, right, it's costless to invest in stocks or in bonds. Okay? What are we getting in the intuition for the result that everybody should be investing in stocks? We're getting that stocks are a better deal. They have a higher expected return. Their contribution to risk is zero, so they are better. They offer you more than bonds. How can we break this result, right? how can we justify zero stockholding that is observed in the data? Well, one way to do it is introduce entry costs into the stock market. You have to pay a fee, right, to enter the stock market. Okay? And then you are going to compare entering the stock market and paying the fee to not entering the stock market and not paying the fee. Okay? And now, what is that going to do to the model? What is the likely implication of this? Okay. So now think of Disneyland. Do you go to Disneyland? Is there something like Disneyland here? No? But you will want to go to Disneyland. You can go to the US, you can go to Europe, it's outside Paris. You should go to Disneyland. So what happens if you are in front of Disneyland and there's a ticket to enter, right? And you have to decide whether to pay the ticket or not. What are you going to think? What are the considerations? You are in front of Disneyland. There is a ticket, and it's not a cheap ticket. It's a ticket, right? And you have to decide, am I going in, am I staying out? What are you going to consider? I mean, first, of course, you're going to consider the price of the ticket, right? I mean, if it's 2 cents, if it's $1, you go, right? It's not a problem. $1,000, you go. But, you know, the size of the ticket is important. What else is important? What do you think? What would you consider?
Is there anything special on?
Precisely. So how much use you're going to make of Disneyland, right? I mean, if you are thinking, or if you know, because you can see everything on the web, that you're not going to use any of the rides, you're not going to go on any of the rides because you're scared. And you're not going to have fun with any of the exhibits because they are for kids and you're a grown-up and I don't know what. If you have no use, if you're not going to use Disneyland, the features of Disneyland, a lot, it's not worth paying the ticket. So it's exactly similar, the idea is exactly similar here, right? So you're going, on the one side, you're going to set the ticket, that's the cost of entry. And on the other side, you're going to set the expected benefits from entry, right? So what are the expected benefits? One is the equity premium, right? The expected return. That's an expected benefit relative to the risk-based asset. If you don't pay the fee, you're not going to get access to that. But the other thing that multiplies the the excess return, I should say. The other thing that multiplies the excess return is that your planned stockholding, your planned visit of the rides, right? So if you're not planning to invest a lot in the stock market, you're not going to enter for a given entry fee and a given equity premium, right? So suddenly, once we introduce fixed costs of entry, all the factors that Grandma would point out to you, all the factors that limit your demand for stocks, make you want to invest little in stocks, become relevant for stock market non-participation, right? Because, you know, so for instance, high risk aversion, you don't want to invest a lot in stocks. So it becomes, you know, what do you mean? You are poorer, you don't have a lot to invest. And you cannot borrow, you don't want to borrow to invest in stocks. You are less likely to enter the stock market because there is the fee, and it's not worth paying the entry fee. Okay? You are pessimistic about the stock market. Your perceived equity premium is very low. Again, for a given entry cost, you're not going to enter. So all sorts of reasonable reasons, factors that make you not participate in the stock market, all of these become relevant right? With, after we introduced these fixed entry costs. So initially we were thinking fixed entry costs and that's it, the Disneyland ticket. But what is the problem that we had ignored and we then realized? If Disneyland charges you a fee, to enter, but lets you stay there forever, you will enter and you will stay there forever, right? Even if you don't go on rides every day, you have the option to go on rides, etc. So we were explaining entries or non-entries into the stock market, but we could not explain exits from the stock market. There are exits also from the stock market. Maybe it's a temporary exit. You invest a little bit, you stay in the market for some time, then you get out for a year, 6 months, something, then you re-enter. The model will not give you exits if you just have fixed entry costs. So then we introduced also fixed participation costs. So if you fall asleep and wake up in Disneyland, the next day the ticket collector will come and say you have to pay to stay, right? So this is the participation cost, right? So that also helps generate exits and also prevents entry, right? If you know that it's not enough to pay this cost once, but you have to pay an exit cost a participation cost to stay there, that reduces your incentive to enter, okay? And then, okay, fine, so that seems to work to generate these things. But what do these costs represent, right? So fixed entry and participation costs, what does it represent? And if you go to the 95 paper, and I'm upset, and I keep saying this also to people, because people have associated these fixed entry costs with another person's paper, Annette Wissing Jorgensen, in 2002. But I published it in 95, so they have to look at my paper. But anyway, some people realize it, some people don't. But we had 3 layers of cost there. So one is the objective cost. So maybe there is a brokerage fee. You have to pay a broker something. You have to pay your bank something. You have to pay a financial advisor something to learn about the stock market and to enter, right? So there's an objective fee. Then, the problem with objective fees is they have been going down in time, right? Over time. And still, stock market participation is not 100%. And it's not close to 100%. So this cannot be, now you have the apps and it's almost costless to trade and enter. Then the second layer, of course, was, okay, you have to accumulate information, you have to keep monitoring the market, you have to keep thinking. So there is a cost of your own time, right? So how many hours per week, how many hours per month, whatever, you need to spend if you are participating in the stock market to make sure that, you don't lose your wealth or, not bad things are happening, right? So that's the opportunity cost of own time. And then there is a third layer of those costs, which is how much you think you have to spend, either in terms of objective costs or in terms of cost of your own time. How much you think you have to, how much time you think you have to spend, acquiring knowledge, trading, monitoring your investments, etc., etc. Okay. So historically, all these years, since 95, since 2002, where these costs were being introduced, we were thinking objective costs are small, they are coming down, so we can only use these costs, these fixed costs of these objective costs to justify the non-participation of very poor people. But we have non-participation across the wealth distribution, okay, less at very high wealth, but still non-participation even in high wealth. So there must be other factors explaining this. For cost of own time, opportunity cost of own time, yes, it makes sense, but we didn't have a lot of evidence on this. So now, 3 weeks ago in Copenhagen, two papers. So one paper got presented and one paper got mentioned by the discussant because she was the author of that other paper. So the paper that got presented was during COVID. There was a shutdown in COVID, right? So people had suddenly more time in their hands. They couldn't work, they couldn't go out, etc. And Denmark has fantastic household finance data. So they could monitor the amount of trading and stock market participation, etc., that took place during COVID, during shutdown. And they found a jump in that. So what happened in terms of this? People got an exogenous shock to the opportunity cost of their time. This was an exogenous shock. It was COVID. They didn't cause COVID. They couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't work, right? So they were shut up, closed up in their apartments with lots of time. So the opportunity cost of time went down, and stock market participation and stock market trading went up. And that's, confirmation that this component of the fixed cost of entry and participation is something that people pay attention to. Okay? I think the other author got, I believe, data from Iceland. She is from Iceland. And Iceland is a tiny country. Tiny country. So you can get lots of good data on tiny countries. Okay? Vietnam, no. But Iceland, and I think it had to do also, I'm forgetting now, I think it had to do also with COVID maybe, or something else, but there, it was a big issue of whether you had children or not, and if you had children in the house, you were finding much smaller effects. If you were not having children, much bigger effects, etc., which is again, a proxy for the opportunity cost of your time. It's not the money that you make, but the demands on your time. Okay, so suddenly, this cost of own time may be more important than we have thought up to now in terms of how much people incorporate them in the decision. And here is the third one, perceived cost. And this is the object of our most recent paper, right? And even now, as I was checking, I went out, I checked my email, and one of my authors presented it yesterday and wrote to everybody, oh, people loved the paper and all this, so we're getting very excited. And what is this? These are the perceptions and misperceptions of these costs. So all these years we have been thinking, we don't know what to make of this. So we were focusing on objective costs primarily, maybe putting in the model cost of own time, maybe making cost proportional, fixed entry and participation cost proportional to the income of people, so that captures dependence of fixed costs on the opportunity cost of time. But we were not doing anything with perceived costs. We didn't know what to do with it. So what we did in this last paper, and most recent paper, hopefully not last, was we went out and we thought, okay, so many years we have been sitting in our offices thinking about possible reasons that might work in a model. Let's go out and ask the people why they're participating or why they're not participating, right? So we got a sociology co-author, and we got a fantastic PhD student who I think has a sociology background, but is now doing household finance research, etc. And we hired professional interviewers, and they interviewed 25, only 25 such people, Germans, right? And we made sure that I think 17 were were non-stockholders, and 8 were stockholders. So we had small numbers, right? But these were qualitative interviews, so meaning there was not a set number of questions or a set script, right? The interviewer had instructions, but the instructions were go with the flow, go with what the people are going to tell you. Don't alert them that we want to hear about the stock market, right? Let them come up with the stock market. And then let them say, but if they come up with the stock market, then you say, do you have stocks, do you not? And they say, oh, no, we don't have stocks. Oh, but why don't you have, that kind of thing. Really working on the stuff that they are telling you, not suggesting things to them, right? Because we wanted to see if we would get any surprises, things that we as researchers have not thought about all these years, right, in the theoretical and the empirical models. And so the interview would start with the question, let's talk about money, right? That was the question. Not, let's talk about the stock market, let's talk about money. And of course, Germans, within a couple of minutes, they would mention stocks. They would mention the stock market. And then, once they mentioned, it would go like this. So, what did we find out from those interviews? We found out that actually perceived costs are huge and are a big factor for non-participation of a number of people, right? Because Germans were telling us the following. They were telling us, before I buy a stock, I have to know everything about the company that I'm buying. Like, before I buy a refrigerator, or before I buy a car, and they were making these, parallel. I have to study all the refrigerators in the market and all the cars in the market and find out what is best for me. So before I buy a stock, I have to do a lot of work on the product, on the company, how it has been doing in its past, in its profits, in, I don't know what, philosophy, ideas, whatever. And also try to figure out, is there always going to be a demand for the product? Or is the product going to disappear in a few months and I lose all my money on all of this? So they said, a couple of them used the term, which is unbelievable, an unbelievable term to use. We want to find safe stocks. There are no safe stocks. For God's sakes. There are no safe stocks. But we want to find safe stocks. So they were thinking that, they are thinking that with all this investigation and this monitoring and studying, they would find the safe stocks. And then upon entering the market, so this goes to this is the fixed entry, and now we go to the fixed participation cost. They thought that they would have to keep an eye on the market every day. Whenever there was a blip, any change in the stock price, they would have to trade, either buy more, sell, continuous trading, etc. Now, in your finance courses, you learn that you cannot time the market, right? There are no possibilities for market timing. And efficient markets, the price incorporates all the available information. So you can't really make money, or at least a lot of money by trading frequently. And I already told you in the introduction that there are these people finding that transactions cost will eat it all up. So it's not a good idea. The good idea is buy and hold and forget about it. But they think that if they enter the market, they must be trading continuously. Which means what? It means that this proportional transaction cost, proportional to the trades that you make, becomes a fixed cost in their idea, right? So if I enter the market, I have to pay all this cost to find out about the market. And then I have to keep monitoring and trading all the time. So this is a huge fixed cost that I'm facing. And it's in my head, it's not in reality, right? I don't need to do that to enter. So this is the perceived cost, right? And then we asked the participants, what are you doing? Now you're in the market, what do you believe? You know? And some told us, we are trading ourselves, and others told us, oh, we have managers, account managers. But regardless of whether they were trading themselves or whether they had account managers, most, not all, but most told us the same thing, that we have to be trading all the time to see when the market goes up, when the market goes down. We have to be trading all the time. So suddenly, these misperceptions become extremely important. And they told us more. They said, you know, we asked about diversification effectively. How many stocks do you hold? How many stocks would you like to hold? And some of them could realize that diversification exists, right? That you could lower the cost by holding more stocks, right? Some of them could realize this. They were smart people and educated people. But they were saying, I can't afford to buy many stocks because for each stock I have to do all of this, right? For each stock I have to study the company, I have to learn all of this, I have to start trading, you know, up and down, etc. And then multiply by 10, multiply by 20. There's no way I can do this, so I stay up. Okay? So the fixed entry participation, the misperception of how the market works, right? And the leads them to perceive huge fixed costs of participation, of entry and of participation, and stops them not only from stock market participation, but also from diversification, right? And it can also lead them to prefer stocks, local stocks, you know, companies that they know, etc., which is another puzzle, the home equity bias puzzle. Anyways, so this is what we learned from this. But then it's just 25 people. So how representative are these people of the entire population? So we went and did a survey of 7,200 Germans, right? Population-wide survey. And that's online, of course, and you can do it. Don't think we started calling 7,200 Germans. But they were emailed and they did things online. And we got this many, you know, there are companies that will do this for you. And we got this many responses. And we put these statements to them, right? We said, here is a statement, I want to find safe stocks, for example. I have to study each company to find the safe stock. How much do you agree with this statement? You know, from 0 to 10. Give a score to this statement, how much you agree with it, etc. And suddenly these statements of the 25 people were quite widely confirmed by the participation, by the survey. So we call it a mixed methods approach. And then some other people did something with AI. So they took more interviews, they took the qualitative interviews and they put ChatGPT, they put them through ChatGPT, right? Because this is a new, you know, development now that you guys will be using as well in the future. And they asked ChatGPT to analyze the statements, right? And you know, we are having a debate, a not so pleasant debate with two other authors who did US data, 285 or something interviews. And they claim that they got ChatGPT to analyze the interviews and they got the same findings as us, right? And we did it, you know, we went through each interview and we were discussing, we were debating, etc., etc. And we would not have been able to do it for 300 interviews, we did it for 25. So here I will give you also a lesson for those of you who will do a PhD. That that's the ugly side of academics, but you should also be aware of that side. So the PhD student in our group of co-authors, she went to a PhD conference, because some people organize PhD conferences and they get those promising PhD students to talk about their dissertations while they are doing the dissertation, before they publish it, before they write up the paper. Early ideas, right, and preliminary results. So she went and presented this paper actually in Copenhagen, in a different place than the one that was us. And one of the organizers, or both organizers, became very interested in our preliminary findings and talked to her, and in coffee breaks and everywhere. So they got the idea of our results, and they went and they did the same thing for US data, and they did it with ChatGPT, so they finished faster. And they used our findings, right, from that early thing and from a later conference to write their own paper. And they didn't even cite us, right? They didn't even cite us in the paper. And this paper is now competing with ours for publication. And if they publish it, I'm not going, yes, I'll be upset, but I am not going to lose in my career. The PhD student will go on the market with this paper, and people will tell her, oh, but we know this. What did you discover here? I mean, these other guys did it before you, and they have published the paper. And she may never get a job, right, if this other paper gets published and they get the credit for it. Okay, policy conclusion for you. I don't expect you to start crying for me, but policy conclusion for you. Do not talk left and right about your PhD dissertation results before you actually have a paper and you upload it on SSRN, right? So then you can claim, I did it first, this is my paper, right? And I had kept saying this, and my co-authors were not agreeing with me, and they let her go and do it, but now we are paying for it. So don't make the same mistake. Be very careful with these PhD student conferences and free advice and all of this. Be very careful. Okay, good. End of parenthesis. So we also did it with AI now. We put Llama 3, I don't know what it was, not ChatGPT, ChatGPT also, and Copilot and things like that. And the funny thing is, we cannot get the results that they claim to have gotten out of the AI. Okay, that's another. Because these AI agents are trained to not tell you garbage, right? Not to hallucinate. Are you guys doing any of this? Are you into AI? Are you getting started? Yes? So they are trained on data sets not to tell you garbage, not to tell you things that are not based on something they have read, right? So I believe that the way they are designed, they don't deviate very much from existing literature. This thing that I'm telling you was not in existing literature, right? So even if they were going in that direction, I think their internal control mechanisms would discourage them from telling you this, right? So anyway, so now we say we're not finding it. Of course, we cannot rule out that they actually found it through ChatGPT, as opposed to feeding it after they read our results. But that's an open issue, and I'm sure in the future ChatGPT will, and related agents will get much better. So this means, second positive policy conclusion for you is that you may be able to use these mixed methods, qualitative interviews, etc. in the future, also being helped by AI to interview many people, and then it will be good to verify them maybe with a representative survey or with something else. But there will be more and more opportunities for your research in the future. Okay. So this paper is not on your reading list, but if you want to look at it, you can go on my SSRN website and you can see it's Duraj, D-U-R-A-J, is the graduate student, and happily she starts with the E, so she comes first. So it's Duraj et al. Is the paper. Now we say that in standard research these things are essentially unobservable. So the way we have prior to this paper, the way we have been able to test for the relevance of fixed costs is to test indirect implications of fixed costs. So in other words, are there factors that make the fixed cost of entry, the ticket fee, lower? If there are, like education, you're more educated, you know more, you can learn faster, so you don't need to spend so much time on stocks, figuring out about the stock market. Or you did finance, you don't need to study what stocks are, etc. So these factors, and you will see, I will show you evidence that college-educated people are much more likely to be participating in the stock market than non-college educated. So are there factors that lower or raise the fixed cost of entry? And then on the right-hand side, you have the excess return, right, times the planned holding. So are there factors that influence the excess return, the perceived excess return, like optimism, for example, we're going to see? Are there factors that influence the planned stock holding level? They should also matter, right? So in empirical research, we are looking for things that should be happening, factors that should be relevant if fixed costs of entry participation are important, right? Considerations. In computational theoretical research, what we do is we cannot calibrate these costs because they are in people's heads. We cannot say that the cost in people's heads is 500. We don't even ask, even in the qualitative interviews of the survey, we cannot ask people how much do you think it costs. I mean, they won't have an answer to that, a number to that, right? They are giving us consideration. So what we do in theoretical research is we write down a model with a fixed entry participation cost, and then we solve for the threshold level of such cost. What is the minimum level of such cost that would keep you out of the market? And then we say, what does it depend on, how reasonable it is, etc. Okay? So that's the kind of approach. I'm going to illustrate it, I'm going to talk about it. Okay, so let's see now an overview of ways to account for non-participation in the literature, right? In the literature. So this first way is the more general heading under which the fixed entry and participation costs enter would be, let's reduce attractiveness of stocks relative to bonds, right? So we know from the intuition that stocks dominate in expected return and they are not riskier in the relevant sense than bonds. So let's try to find ways to reduce the relative attractiveness. So fixed cost is one. This is the recent Jorgensen paper that I was talking about. This is a paper, that I have talked about in the macro. I'll just remind you a little bit later about the portfolio share, but this is infinite horizon. If you want to see finite horizon, it's the state of the art is this paper, but it has more complicated utility function. And expected stock payoffs have to overcome this fixed entry and participation curve. Okay, then limit expected return attractiveness under all of this. So here is an important thing, trust. Okay? So So my personal story on this, you don't see my name here. My personal story on this is in 1992, I went, the Why Do So Few for the 95 paper was still a working paper, and I went to Moscow. I was a young assistant professor. I went to Moscow to present the paper. And at the end of the presentation, 2 Russians came, and they told me, you have all these fixed costs and other things in all these reasons, possible reasons. You know why we don't hold stocks? Because we don't believe they are worth more than the paper they are printed on, okay? Because what is a stock? It's a promise to get dividends, future dividends, right? But if you don't believe they will give you these dividends, if you don't believe that they will tell you the truth about these dividends, you don't trust the stock market, you're not going to invest in stocks. That was their point. And I thought, oh, Russians, they are going to get out of it, you know, it's a country in transition, a few years down the road, this won't be a problem. But, so I didn't do anything about it. But Luigi Guiriso, my friend and former co-author, and got together with Sapienza and Zingales at the University of Chicago, and they wrote a brilliant paper in 2008, and they looked across countries, and they found that countries that had a lot of stock investor protection, right? A lot of investor protection, more generally, they were, you know, and therefore there was more trust in the stock market, or people who were declaring that they were trusting, they were more trusting compared to others, they were more likely to be participating in the stock market. So they said trust is a new factor, a different factor from the ones we have. And it helps, you know, what they said and they claimed and they stressed was that it helps explain even rich non-stockholders, right? Because with the fixed costs, we were focusing primarily on the objective costs, etc., and they are small. So these objective costs cannot explain the rich Italians, right, who have these private businesses, or they have investment real estate, and they're not investing in stocks. I mean, they can definitely afford to invest in stocks, given the objective costs, but they're not investing. So all 3 authors of this are Italians, so they thought, okay, trust plays a big role, and there are surveys. It's called, one of them is called Eurobarometer, and that's for European countries, and they ask people, would you say that you trust others, or would you say that one cannot be careful enough with people, right? And the people who are saying, you know, they trust others, they're more likely to be participating in the stock market. And people coming from countries that foster trust through investor protection are more likely to be participating in the stock market, even in a different country, right? Even when they migrate, etc. So trust seems to be a relevant consideration there, and I'm sorry I didn't take the Russians seriously. Okay. So how do we formalize this? I mean, in empirical models, there are the survey responses on trust. If we're going to write a theoretical model, how do we formalize trust? How did these people formalize it? And the way they did it was they introduced a perceived probability to be cheated in the stock market, right? Not to be given the correct level of dividends, not to be given what was promised to you. So you have a probability, you have the equity premium there, but you introduce a probability that you're going to get the equity premium, plus another 1 minus that probability that I'm going to get less, or I'm going to get 0. So what does that do to, in the presence of fixed costs, what does that do to your calculation? It limits the perceived excess return on stocks, the perceived equity premium. You're saying, yeah, maybe the data tell me this, but I'm not going to get it, right? I'm going to get much less, and therefore it's not worth me participating. Okay? So they are operating on the perceived equity premium through this probability of cheating. But of course, you need to have also some fixed cost type of setup where people are making this comparison. Because if you are in the model without anything, if you are in the model with the absurdum, right? If you are in the model without fixed costs, and I tell you the equity premium is smaller, doesn't matter. It's still a positive number, and you still get the absurdum. You still get the product of two positive numbers equaling 0. So it's not going to help you explain non-participation in the stock market, right? Trust. But if you are going to put it in a model with the fixed cost, then it helps, right? Explain also the rich. Because in the limit, the rich may have 0, huge probability of being cheated, and then you come up with a tiny equity, perceived equity premium, and then it's not worth they're paying even the small cost. Second thing, which analytically in the model is going to look similar, but it's not identical, is subjective expectations. I told you already earlier today that there are expectation surveys, right? So there have been for some years expectations about the stock market, surveys about your expected return in the stock market, okay? And again, there is a lot of heterogeneity. So this paper, Dominitz and Mansky, got published in the Journal of the European Economic Association in 2007, and they looked at US data, right, that was asking about expectations regarding the stock market. And they found enormous heterogeneity of expectations. And the funny thing is everybody's looking at the same stock market. It's not like asking, somebody in the US versus asking somebody in Italy or in Germany, about the stock market. It is the same stock market. And they have such huge heterogeneity in expectations regarding the same stock market, right? So they said the size, the perceived equity premium matters. You see, it sounds like the previous one, but the reason is different, right? The previous one with trust, it was the probability of being cheated that was operating on that. Here, it's not the probability. They don't perceive the probability to be cheated. They just have a very different understanding of the equity premium in the market, right? And some are optimistic about the equity premium, and some are pessimistic about the equity premium, okay? And if you are thinking about this comparison in the presence of fixed costs, this comparison, the fixed cost versus the perceived equity premium times the size of holding, the planned holding, if you are very pessimistic about the equity premium, this first factor, diminishes very much, and you are not going to pay the fixed cost rent. Right? So that works. Now, if you go and you read the original Dominitz and Mansky paper, these are both, brilliant people, and Mansky is, did he get the Nobel Prize? If he didn't, he's about to. He's that level of guy. They got carried away, and if you read the last part of the paper, it says, we don't need fixed costs. We only need pessimism, and we can explain non-participation. But they are wrong there, because of the reasons I told you that, even if you expect to lose money in the stock market, if you expect to lose money, that's the most pessimistic that you are, right? What should you do? You should short stocks. You shouldn't be out of the market. You should short stocks. And if you're going to tell me, oh, but people are not allowed to short stocks, that's the explanation. Well, let's go back. Frustrated short sellers. This is not an explanation. You need the fixed cost to be able to make the comparison and say, with such degree of pessimism, no, it's not working, right? So, if you're going to read the paper, which is a very nice paper to read, ignore the end. But if you ask them today, they still believe in the end. So maybe you read the end as well. You know, say, they say I'm too nerdy because I'm saying, oh, yeah, but you have to make this comparison, say, approximately true. Anyway, okay. Then a third possibility that was raised was this interest rate wedge. So people, Davis, Kubler-Ross, and three other very smart people, they said, just a second, the standard model assumes that the borrowing and the saving rate are equal, right? I told you there is one risk-free rate. You can borrow, eventually I rule out borrowing, so I don't go into this issue. But what they were saying is if you put a model there that allows borrowing, it doesn't matter if you're poor. If you're poor, the model will tell you you should borrow to invest in stocks, okay? So you should really be participating in the stock market even if you're poor, right? But their argument was the borrowing rate is going to be very high that you will be charged. And maybe the difference with the expected stock return is tiny or even negative, right? So you're not going, actually they didn't claim negative, but they say it's going to be very tiny. So again, in the presence of fixed costs, you are ideally, theoretically, in the presence of fixed costs, you are not going to make the choice for such a tiny benefit to borrow to invest in the stock market. By the way, never borrow to invest in the stock market. That's another lesson. I have a bankrupt, best man in our wedding who borrowed to invest in the stock market. So he went to bankruptcy afterwards. Okay, don't do that. Okay, learn from my life experience. Okay, now a different way is to say, assume the agent does not consider the full asset menu that has been used. So what is that? Well, recall, the intuition of the non-participation puzzle was that somebody will compare stocks to the riskless asset. Will make the expected return and risk comparisons. But what if they don't know about stocks, right? They are ignorant about stocks. They don't know what stocks are. Then they are not going to be making the comparisons. And they are out of the market because of ignorance, not because they think something else is better, right? So Guiso and Iapelli, actually in 2005, they went out and did a survey of Italian households. And they asked them, not if they were holding, first they asked them if they were holding these things, but if they said they were not holding any of these things, they asked them, do you know what they are? Okay. And the things were stocks, mutual funds, and managed accounts, okay? So they found that only 33, 1/3 of the Italian sample were aware of the existence of all three things, right? And you know that, maybe you know that stocks exist, but you don't know that you can invest very little in mutual funds. You think you need to spend a lot of money to buy whole stocks. Or you think that you need to be trading all the time. You don't know about managed accounts, right? So you end up, this ignorance prevents you from investing in the stock market, okay? So that's the case of asset ignorance that could explain part of things. And indeed, what we found with our qualitative interviews is quite consistent with that. not that Germans, the Germans we talked to, had some money, had some wealth, etc. So they were not ignorant. I mean, they knew about stocks, but some of them didn't realize that you don't have to have 10,000 euro to get into the stock market. That you can start with a very limited amount just by buying a share in a mutual fund, right? That's very well diversified because it's a share in a portfolio of stocks, but still doesn't cost a lot of money. So some of them didn't know about this, and of course the managed accounts, they said, they didn't know how to access those, etc. So asset ignorance or process ignorance is one. Then there has been work on social interactions, and we're going to have a whole chapter on that. And I think you will find it quite fascinating. I mean, I think it's lots of interesting things that are coming out. And here, I just mentioned 2 seminal papers in this, but we're going to see much more later on, much more systematically. But Hong, Kubik, and Stein, they did a survey in the US, and they found that sociability encourages stockholding. So people who were saying that they were going to church often, or people who were going to social clubs often, were more likely to be participating in the stock market. Okay? And then you wonder, I mean, at church you're supposed to pray, you're not supposed to be talking about the stock market. So what's going on? It was not about praying, it was about the social aspect afterwards, because if you go to a church in the US, after that there's coffee. And the coffee in the coffee room, everybody shows up in the best clothes, and they are driving the best cars, and they are chatting and gossiping a lot about people, etc. So the more sociable you are, the more likely you are to hear about successes of people with the stock market, or how people manage to enter the stock market and how easy it is, etc., etc. So they found that sociability increases stock market participation, and they also found that this was more true of widely held assets. So assets that lots of people were holding. They were not. It was not. The effect was bigger for assets that lots of people were holding, which also makes sense. That the greater the participation in an asset, the bigger the probability that somebody in your social circle participates and that you hear about it after church. Okay, so that's one thing. And how can we think of it in terms of our analysis? We can think of it as reducing the fixed cost of entry and participation. Right? It's giving you information for free. You don't need to go out and figure it out yourself. And Duflo and Saez, they found, so, I mean, we're going to go into it, but they found that if more people in your office are holding a particular new pension product, then you're more likely to hold that pension product. But notice now the problem, and I'm not going to give you the answer now so as to build up some suspense, but just telling me that the people in your office are holding more of this pension product and you are holding more of this pension product doesn't prove that they caused you to hold it, right? Because the people in your office are sharing the same environment, right? So you have the common shocks problem. They are suffering the common shocks. And the people in your office chose a similar job to you, right? So they likely have common preferences with you, right? So maybe, the fact that you and them are holding the same product is a result of common preferences and or common shocks. So if they had just said this, they would not have convinced anybody that these are peer effects. But in fact, they did much more, and we are going to talk about it when we get to the peer effects section. And then a more behavioral explanation by Barberis, Huang, and Taylor narrow framing. And the idea, their idea, that's an AER paper actually, American Economic Review, and their idea was that people don't put stocks and bonds in the same mental account, in the mental framework. They're not comparing them. They are thinking separately, how much should I put in stocks, and now how much should I put in bonds, right? So they are thinking separately about these two things. That's the sort of narrow framing. They are framing their portfolios narrowly. So they are separating their stock thinking from their bond thinking, and then they don't have to make this comparison of expected returns and contribution to risk. So that's yet another way to find that. But I must say, to justify that, but I must say that in our interviews now, we didn't find a lot of support for this. I mean, people were typically comparing stocks to other assets that are easier to hold, right? So some of them were comparing stocks to their bank deposits. It's easy to put money in the bank. Look at how much work I need to do to put money in the stock, in the stock market, or comparing to some other simple saving product, sort of a time deposit where you put some money in the bank and you say you're not going to touch it for 6 months, for a year, and you get a higher interest rate for that, etc. So people seem to be making comparisons. But anyway, narrow framing says you keep things separate. There are other ways to magnify the risks. So introduce a probability of disasters. So we saw this in the equity premium literature, and I told you it has made a comeback now. But the idea here is maybe there is a small probability of a simultaneous stock market crash and huge unemployment. So your stock wealth goes down dramatically and your labor income goes down dramatically at the same time, and that's a total disaster for you. In the state-of-the-art paper that we have now on stock holding is a 2017 paper in the Journal of Finance by Weiser and others. They introduced a small probability of a disaster, but it was just a stock wealth disaster, not combined with labor income. And they found that with 2-3% perceived probability of a stock market downturn that wipes out 3/4 of your wealth, not all of your wealth, but 3/4 of your wealth, you get enough traction, and also small fixed cost of participation, you get enough traction to send people out of the stock market, to discourage people from the stock. The idea, of course, is that in these disasters, the marginal utility of consumption is huge, right? Because consumption is so low, marginal utility of consumption is very huge. And if you have a model in which you introduce these disasters, they are going to dominate your plan, your optimal plan. You are going to try to avoid getting to these disasters as much as possible. And one reason to avoid getting into that disaster is to put zero in stocks, right? Or a tiny amount in stocks. So that's, and Sule Alam in 2012 in Quantitative Economics, the journal called Quantitative Economics, which is part of Econometrica, or a subsidiary of Econometrica, she introduced those costs and found that they could explain value. And then finally, and perfect timing, I amaze myself, is to introduce competition of stocks with another asset. Okay, so here, one idea by Heaton and Lucas in 2000 was private businesses. people prefer to put money in their private business than to put money in stocks. And it can be a substitute and, you know, even earn them higher expected returns. Rusanov has introduced a model, and we're going to study this model, that justifies this. So he says, I think you will enjoy this. I will tell you this. And I will tell you this now and send you off, and you will be thinking about it as you walk home. Okay. And the other thing is competition with investment in human capital, which is you prefer to spend money on education over some period to build up your human capital rather than investing it in stocks. And then, you know less about stocks, so you haven't invested a lot, etc. So that can be a factor. But let me go to Rusanov. So Rusanov said, you want to beat the Joneses. You want to be wealthier than your neighbors, right? Not simply keep up with the Joneses, not simply keep up with them or catch up with them, but be wealthier than them. So what's a way to do that? A way to do that is to get stocks, or a way to do this is to have a private business. If you get stocks, and the stock market goes up, they also get wealthy. Okay? You are not beating them. You are catching up with them. You are keeping up with them. But if you buy a private business and you get rich, the private business does well, then only you get wealthy, not them. So you jump the queue, so to speak. Right? So that provides a reason to prefer this real estate. Real estate also, but private business risk to stock market risk. That is why Okay, so I hope I have whetted your appetite for more. And I hope to see you tomorrow. But now I know that it's not just a mandatory elective, but your presence in the mandatory elective is mandatory. So now I know I will see you tomorrow. What a joy! What a joy! Yeah, that's great. That's good. Okay.
Professor, can I ask all of the articles that you listed in the syllabus, you will send to us, or we will find out some?
You will find yourselves, because it's too much to find all, but what I'm saying on how to find them, you have your library here allows you to access journals electronically, no? Or?
Yes.
You can find the journals online, no? You can download the journals online, no? What technology do you have? If you are in the library, you can download them. Can you download them from home?
I think so. I think the library gives us an account, but I don't know how wide we can search for.
So I would say try it. Now this is your opportunity to try it, because so far I guess you are doing more textbooks, but this course definitely you want to be looking at papers. So try to see if you can download the Journal of Finance or the Review of Financial Studies or whatever. I mean, you see lots of things. I put asterisks, things that are more important than others, right? I mean, typically. But it's a longer list. Maybe you develop an interest in the area. You have it also for the future. But try to look to see if you can access the journal. If you cannot, then go to the author's website. And then you should be able to find a working paper version of the paper on the author's website. Now, some authors are dumb, and what they do is they provide a link. So, of course, it's a Journal of Finance publication. They provide a link to the Journal of Finance website, But if you don't have access to the Journal of Finance, you cannot download their paper, and that's dumb, okay? So, if you see such a case, try also SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, because most of the published papers have appeared in SSRN at some point, right? And then look at the final version of the paper that they post on SSRN. And that's where you can get it for free, okay? Yeah, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you have a question? Or no? No, good. And if all fails, just email the author and tell them, no, really, I mean, if all fails, and I don't think it will fail, I think at least SSRN is going to work. Yeah? And that's ssrn.org or ssrn.com.
Do they have like assignments or problem sets?
I will give you problem sets, so you will see that the types of exams are more like, true, false, uncertain, but you have to justify, so I give you some statements, and then you have that. Maybe there is an analytical problem as well, but it's a different mix compared to macro, where there's more math.